Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. As always, I'm Jeremiah, and actually Anthony is not here. Again, he is feeling a little bit under the weather, but he should be back next week. But as of now, you got me for another show of this podcast. So last night, the Thursday night football game between the Oakland Raiders and the Kansas City Chiefs was everything what I expected it would have been. It was very low scoring. A lot of unorthodox performance from certain players I thought would perform well. And a couple of performances that I didn't think would happen. Most notably, Alex Smith did play out of his mind in the first half. He had over 200 yards and a touchdown, and he was really efficient last night. He did end the night with 264 yards and a touchdown. Did throw a pick, but did not have any other mistakes after that besides a fumble later in the third quarter that was recovered by the Raiders. So he did have 2 turnovers in that game, but he did have a really good yardage total. And for the Raiders, Derek Carr did not play anywhere near like an MVP last night. He didn't have any of the great numbers that we're accustomed to seeing. And, you know, Derek Carr really looked uncomfortable going against the Chiefs defense. I haven't seen him play that. I haven't seen him play that bad or looked that uncomfortable since the Las Vegas Bowl in 2012 when he was with Fresno State. When he was playing against USC, I have not seen him play like that ever since. Even in his rookie year, when the Raiders started out so bad, he looked a lot better than that game. But this was probably his worst game of his NFL career, really his worst game of the year. And this might really hurt him in the MVP chances. He is still a top 10 quarterback in fantasy. The Raiders are playing against the Chargers. So I do think that Derek Carr is going to have a bounce back game. It is going to be during the championship round for some people. And the playoff round, probably the first round of the playoffs for some people. I know it will be the first round of the playoffs in my league. But yeah, Derek Carr, he just did not have it last night. Maybe it's because the Chiefs knew that Derek Carr was going to be in shotgun the whole time. And maybe that is why they defended it so well. And don't forget that the Chiefs have a really good defense as well. They got Marcus Peters and Eric Berry, probably one of the best secondaries in the league. And then they had a really good play at the end of the game by the secondary. But with Carr throwing it 40 times, you expect Derek Carr to have a lot of yards and a lot of touchdowns. He didn't throw a pick. He didn't throw a touchdown. All he could muster up was 117 yards throwing on 41 attempts. Yeah, it doesn't doesn't really add up, but he did play against a good team. It is a cold weather condition, so maybe that did play a part. Don't forget, he is battling a pinky injury. He does have 10 days to heal up. The Raiders have 10 days to bounce back, and I do expect him to bounce back with a big game against the San Diego Chargers. And the San Diego Chargers are a really good – they're actually a better team than they were before when the Raiders and the Chargers played each other earlier this season. But as for the running backs in Oakland, Latavius Murray had a really good game. 22 attempts, 103 yards, and a touchdown. He looks like he's back to being the bell cow of the offense. Earlier in the year, the Raiders started off with a committee with Latavius Murray, Jalen Richard, DeAndre Washington. And, Washington, he's been a healthy scratch for the past month. Jalen Richard has emerged as the lead change of pace back, and Latavius Murray is now back to being the number one back for the Raiders. He could have had an even better game. Could have had a better game against the Chiefs. The fact that Derek Carr threw for 41 times really hurt Latavius Murray's numbers last night. If Latavius Murray, to me, I feel like he should have got the ball 30 times, maybe 35. He could have had an even bigger game than what he did last night. They could have even probably helped the Raiders possibly tie it up at the end of the game. And, they almost didn't give Latavius Murray the first touchdown, actually. It was reviewed. It looked like he almost didn't get in, but then it looked like he did get in. And, it looked like they're about to vulture a touchdown from Latavius Murray. And they didn't. It counted. It was actually a really big play in the game, in the first half. And I think Latavius Murray is someone that is a RB1 moving forward, especially in the big money leagues, in money weeks, especially going against the Chargers next Sunday. So I do expect Latavius Murray to have a real good game against the Chargers, and I think you can fully expect to trust him now moving forward. With their Carr not having a really good game, that obviously affected the receiving corps of the Raiders. Amari Cooper was the leading receiver last night with 29 yards. Rivera was right behind him with 26. The leading target getter for the Raiders last night was Amari Cooper. Only caught 5 of them, and he had 29 yards. And then you got Seth Roberts, who's been probably really good. He's been one of the best slot receivers in the league. He's been really good as the number 3 guy for the Raiders. He had 9, only had 2 receptions for 12 yards. And then Crabtree had 7 targets, only mustered up 21 yards on 4 catches. So the Chiefs defense were playing the Raiders offense so well is that Derek Carr and his receivers, they couldn't get anything done. And it looks like they're more worried about being cold than making plays. That's what it looked like to me. But moving forward for the Raiders, it looks like you can fully trust the Raiders going against the San Diego Chargers next week. And, the Chiefs, they're not the most explosive offense in fantasy by any means. But, man, what a game from Travis Kelce and the Kansas City Chiefs. What a game. He had his 4th game he has 4 straight game with 100 yards receiving. And he brings a whole element to the Chiefs offense, and he looks like he is going to have a top 5 finish in tight ends in fantasy. And he's someone that you can you have to trust him now at this point. He was a must start if you didn't start him already. But yeah, he looks like he's about to finish as a top 5 tight end. Could possibly finish as possibly the top 2, top 3. And he's someone that he's going to put up numbers moving forward, and him and Alex Smith just have really great chemistry. Really great chemistry, and that's something that you have to look at. And Travis Kelce, he's not going to go anywhere. It looks like he might be matchup proof right now. I think he's someone that you can fully trust moving forward. The Chiefs do play the Titans next, so that's a really huge matchup. And then they play the Broncos on Christmas night, so that I would start him in that game as well. You can't tell me anything why I shouldn't start Kelce. All I can think of is reasons why I should start him. And for the receiving corps here for the Chiefs, Tyreek Hill had another great game. Tyreek Hill had a great game. 66 yards and a touchdown, 6 targets. And he also had a punt return touchdown. So Tyreek Hill has emerged as a star in fantasy, and I think he's someone you could possibly trust moving forward. He just brings a whole another element to the Chiefs' offense. He brings them a deep threat. Alex Smith was actually making some big-time throws last night down the field. That's something we don't normally see. But I do think Tyreek Hill is a big part of this offense, and you can trust him as your second or third receiver in your lineup. And as for the running backs for the Chiefs, Spencer Ware didn't really have a great game. He had 56 yards on 20 carries, but they were really tough yards. He didn't have a touchdown. That touchdown went to Sharkandrick West. And Spencer Ware is someone you have to trust moving forward. He is the bell cow of the offense. He is a workhorse. They are playing the Titans and the Broncos. The Titans game is he should have really good numbers in that game. The Broncos is a matchup I'm really worried about, but he's someone that you have to start moving forward, and you have to trust him, especially in the playoffs. But we're going to take our first break here at the Golden State Media Concepts Football Podcast, and I'm going to talk about some players you might have to stay away from, maybe some backfields in Denver, and a couple of other players who you might have to stay away from heading towards the playoffs here in fantasy. But we're going to take our first break here at the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. And I want to talk about a couple of players maybe you should stay away from the next 2 weeks. Well, we have a couple of backfield situations here in Green Bay and in Denver that look really messy, and that is not a good thing to say here heading to Week 14. They have numerous running backs, and they both can't run the ball. Well, I wouldn't say they both can't run the ball really well. First, I want to talk about Green Bay Packers. Their running game is all over the place here. It looks like Ty Montgomery is the leading running back again. He did have 6 carries for 40 yards against the Houston Texans. And the next, Christine Michael led the touches and running backs for the Packers. The former Seahawk, he had 9 carries for 19 yards. And James Starks had 4 carries for 1 yard. So, what to make of this backfield situation here in Green Bay? Man, it's hard for me to trust any of these 3 guys. James Starks looked like he was about to be the workhorse of the backfield. That obviously isn't happening. Christine Michael looks like he still has some left in the tank. Remember, Christine Michael started off the year really well with Seattle, so maybe he can potentially end the year as the Green Bay Packers' lead running back. And the best running back on this team, though, is Ty Montgomery, even though he is a receiver. Ty Montgomery had a total of 56 yards against the Houston Texans last Sunday. And I do think all three of these guys are very hard to trust heading to the playoffs and possibly to the final week of the season for some fantasy players out there. Yeah, I don't like any of these three guys. Maybe if you have a roster spot, I would say maybe you should add Ty Montgomery to your team. See what he does this Sunday against the Seattle Seahawks. And if he has a really decent game, then I would say maybe we can potentially talk about starting him in week 15. But I would take a flyer on Ty Montgomery. I would not start him. Maybe just have him on a roster. And I would say just play the wait and see game. As for Christine Michael, James Starks, it's hard for me to trust any of these two guys. I really thought James Starks was going to be the guy to lead the running game for the Packers. Christine Michael, he could still do it. I wouldn't be surprised if he did it, but I'm just not a believer in any of these running backs outside Ty Montgomery, and even I'm skeptical of Montgomery being the leading dog in the backfield for the Packers. And I would not be surprised if he were to lead the backfield in touches against Seattle. Again, because, the Packers, they can put Ty Montgomery in a variety of ways. They can have him catch the ball out of the backfield. They can hand it off to him. So I think that's the reason why I would take a flyer on Montgomery. It looks like they have more of a skill set there than they do with Michael and Starks. So that's why I trust Montgomery more going forward, but I would not start him against the Seahawks. It's a very tough team, a very tough defense to play against. But I will wait and see what he does this Sunday against the Seahawks, and maybe we can talk about next week if you should start him or not. Another backfield that's really messy, and that's actually really bothered me, is the Denver Broncos running back. They just signed Justin Forsett last week, actually this past week, and they still have Devontae Booker there, who hasn't really played well as a rookie. They did expect a lot out of Devontae Booker after C.J. Anderson went down. He did have a great game against the Houston Texans on a Monday night game. 17 carries for 83 yards and a touchdown. So after that, he was the starting running back. Then the next week against the Chargers, a day before Halloween, 19 carries for 54 yards and a touchdown. So I was like, okay, maybe decent. Then he plays against the Raiders, a team that he should have played pretty decently well against. He couldn't do anything against that team. That team couldn't do anything against the Raiders that night. And his two best games of the season came 2 weeks after. He had 2 straight weeks of having 75 yards or more in weeks 12 and 13. Weeks 12 and 13 against the Saints and the Chiefs. Actually, I'm sorry. It was weeks 11 and 12. In weeks 11 and 12 versus the Saints and the Chiefs, these were probably his second or third best game of the year. Against the Saints, Booker had 24 attempts and 76 yards. Booker had 24 attempts and 79 yards against the Chiefs. So he doesn't really have a lot of breakaway speed. He's not averaging a lot per carry. Last week against the Jaguars, a team that he should have ran all over against. They're not good. They're not really good against the run. The Jaguars are actually decent against the pass, but against the run, they're not as good as they are against the pass. And he only mustered up 35 yards on 18 attempts. He did have a touchdown, but he should have so much more. And he's only averaging just over 2 yards a carry ever since he became the starter. His season average is actually 3.5. So, I don't know. Booker is someone that's hard for me to trust going to the playoffs. And with Justin Forsett there, he's been in Gary Kubiak's offense before when he was in Houston. And there's reports that there's going to be a 50-50 split between Forsett and Devontae Booker. This is a backfield I would stay away from moving forward. I think it's something to stay away from even in the playoffs. I just think this is something we have to wait and see for next fantasy season. But I would take a flyer on Forsett, see how he does, and if he happens to play well, maybe you can potentially start him next week. But I would just take the wait-and-see approach with both of these guys. I don't think Devontae Booker is someone you're going to start right away. He's just having a tough time running for the Broncos there. But yeah, with moving with those two backfields moving forward, they're just hard for me to trust. And, it remains to be seen how both of these situations shake out after Sunday. But we're going to take our second break here to Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, and I am going to tell you which players you should start and you should sit when we come back here from the break.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Football Podcast, Fantasy Football Podcast, that is. It's time to get into some starts and sits here for week 14. And there's two players I do think you must absolutely have to start. There's a lot of players on this list. I had Jeremy Hill against the Browns. I think he is a must start. I got Devontae Freeman as a must start against the Rams. Jordan Howard against the Lions, I think is a must start. Emmanuel Sanders with Trevor Siemian coming back against the Jacksonville Jaguars. I think Emmanuel Sanders and Demaryius Thomas, I think you have to put them in your lineup. But there's two players in particular I think that need to be in your lineups, especially in a week that has so many implications for you guys. First of all, I think this is the week. I think this is finally the week where we're going to see a breakout game this season from Sammy Watkins. I think it's going to finally happen. I thought Watkins was going to have a good game I thought he was going to have a phenomenal game against the Raiders, but the Raiders just played really well in the second half. Watkins did lead in targets with 9, and he's only mustered up 32 yards and 38 yards. 32 of his 38 yards came on the Bills' first drive. After that, I thought, okay, we're gonna have a good game. Nope, it didn't happen. He just so really his team, the Tyrod Taylor that may play a part in why he didn't put up so many numbers. But, that Raiders defense was just playing tough against them. But he's going against a Pittsburgh defense that really played well against Odell Beckham and the New York Giants. But that game was at Heinz Field. This game is at the Ralph for Buffalo. So it's a home game for Buffalo. I think the Bills are going to perform a little bit more better than they would if this game was at Heinz Field. But I do think the Bills are going to try to keep up with the Steelers. I do think this game has the potential to be a high-scoring game, and that means Watkins is probably going to get involved a lot in this game. And if the Bills score a lot of points, I think that means Watkins is a huge part of that. So I do think Watkins is someone you have to start in your lineups. I think this is a breakout game, And, I'm not saying that the Bills are going to win, but I expect a big offensive day from the Buffalo Bills offense. And I say, Sammy Watkins is someone you have to start. And it's going to the same game, actually. Going to the same game against Buffalo and Pittsburgh. I think the Darius Green is a must start now. The Darius Green has been a monster last week. He was a monster last week against the New York Giants, 110 yards and a touchdown. Even before that, he had 67 yards on 2 receptions. Could have had an even bigger day. So he looks more comfortable in this offense now. This offense has so many weapons on the field. There's so many players to defend. You got Le'Veon Bell. You got to defend him on the ground and through the air. You got to defend Antonio Brown. That's tough to do. But, he's someone that is going to become more involved, and that's scary. The fact that he had 110 yards and a touchdown, and he only played 35 of 73 snaps. So I think he's in for an even bigger day here against the Buffalo Bills. And as for players, I think you should sit. I got 2 in particular I want to talk about. I talked about Devontae Booker earlier in the show, but I think he's someone you have to sit. If you start him, I don't know what to tell you, but if you have players a lot better on your team, you have to stay away from Devontae Booker. Booker's only averaged 2.8 yards a carry since becoming the starter. And, he's probably been one of the worst running backs since then. He's only been above, he hasn't had many 10-plus fantasy performances. He's just hadn't had a lot. And, to me, I think he's more of an RB3 now because of Justin Forsett. So for that reason, I do think he's someone that could get really kind of have a bad day. For the Denver Broncos there. He is going against it is a pretty good matchup against the Tennessee Titans, but I do think the fact that Justin Forsett's going to be more involved in this offense really concerns me, and that's why I think you have to stay away from Devontae Booker there. But my next player you should say is going to be really surprising because of the team he's going against. But I'm going to have to maybe suggest recommend you guys to probably sit Brandon Marshall of the New York Jets. He is playing against practically the worst defense in the league in the San Francisco 49ers, but we forget that his quarterback for this game is going to be Bryce Petty. Bryce Petty is only completing just under 55% of his passes. He only has 5 yards per attempt, 2 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. He's thrown to Marshall 11 times. Marshall has caught 7 of them for a total of 41 yards. So no reception from Marshall from Petty has not gone over 13. It's a great matchup, but I do think the fact that Bryce Petty is Brandon Marshall's quarterback in this game is going to really hurt Brandon Marshall against the 49ers. And, Marshall hasn't really put up good numbers consistently anyway. He hasn't had a 100-yard game since the Pittsburgh Steelers in October 9th. So Brandon Marshall wasn't having a great season anyway. He's having pretty decent season, but he wasn't having a huge offensive season. And that has to do a lot with this quarterback play. He only had 43 yards in that blowout against the Indianapolis Colts there. And he did have 67 yards and a touchdown against the Patriots. But other than that, he hasn't really shown a whole lot. He only has 3 touchdowns of the year. So I do recommend sitting Brandon Marshall because of the team he's on and the quarterback. But, I do expect that game to be really ugly offensively. This is a game. It can either be really ugly offensively or really high scoring, depending on how these offenses perform for the 49ers and the Jets. But, that concludes our show. I'd like to thank you guys for tuning into the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. We'll be back next week with 2 more episodes. I will do the show solo on Tuesday, and Anthony should be back next Friday. But, I'd like to thank you guys for tuning in. You can catch the show on a variety of platforms, Google Play, Stitcher, iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, and on the website, gsmcpodcast.com. And, you can, always, you can always follow the show on Twitter at GSMC_football and on Instagram at the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. I thank you guys for tuning in, and have a good day.